What does globalization mean, according to Faye Harrison? I think that she wants us to, instead of portraying people as having completely different realities in far off places, to do more connecting of the dots. And what globalization means for us is that what's happening in these places that are far away, or what we once called, and what she still uses the term, the third world, and those faraway places, and we think, oh, that things are so tough there, are also happening in the so-called first world, or in the urban centers of our own society. And so the same kinds of policies, the same kinds of struggles, that we need to connect these kinds of things. And this is something that is perhaps even more important, more apparent in today's world. So the fact that her examples are from the 1990s and the 2000s, but we see this happening in terms of policies that are enacted on other countries, have implications for the kinds of people that then show up at, say, the US border right now. So if we have a policy of fomenting disruption in a country in Central America, the refugees from that policy often show up at our border. Or she mentions the case of Haiti. We see now Haitian refugees who have gone through Brazil and are trekked all the way up and are coming into the border of the US. So what happens abroad, it cannot just be kept there. It has implications for what happens at home. Or some people in today's world are saying we need to connect the dots with the kinds of oppression that is happening in the Middle East, with the kinds of oppression that is happening at home. These things have implications for us all over the world. So this is one of the key points of globalization. At the time, this was being talked about in terms of what were called structural adjustment and neoliberalism. And so on the one hand, these were policies that were forced upon other countries, basically to try to expand the role of the market. So the idea was that the capitalist market should be the primary way in which people get their goods and services, and to reduce the role of the government or reduce the role of the state. And so this was again imposed upon other countries by the policies of structural adjustment, but it also was a neoliberal policy, or what was called neoliberalism, perhaps still is, and applied to the United States as well. Harrison says that it is meant to valorize laissez-faire capitalism.
Free capitalism.
Yeah, anything goes, you might say. Yeah, more a freer capitalism, let us say. A freer capitalism that would deregulate economies, trust the markets to be more efficient, you might say. And the result, this is still true today, right? That we spend more money on the military and on prisons than on schools. And so, again, this results in some distorted policy outcomes. The state or government seems to be shrunk in the role of providing social welfare to people, but we can still afford to spend money on our armed forces and on incarcerating people than for schools and healthcare and those kinds of things. And so what Harrison, and she's drawing on the work of many others here, says is that this leads to increasing inequalities. Where are these inequalities? Yeah, so there's an increased inequalities between she talks about the North and the South. We've talked about this before. We're not talking about the North as in the US North and South. We're talking about what we might consider the industrialized or post-industrial countries of the North, and what is considered to be the global South, that those inequalities are increasing. But we also see that the inequalities are widening within each country. So both within the United States, within European countries, and within places like Brazil or Haiti or various countries in India, in the global South. You see a widening of inequalities based on race and class. And so you have both an increase in inequalities between regions, but also within each region. Harrison says that women bear the brunt of global apartheid. And she says that, yes, this is in part because you have this idea of women's work. So that the idea is that women are able to do are naturally able to do things like sew garments, and so you don't need to pay them more because that's just part of what they do. And again, according to Harrison, that globalization in its neoliberal form is fundamentally a gendered phenomenon marked by a patriarchal logic. So perhaps it is to extend, to perpetuate this idea of a nuclear family or a patriarchal logic in which women are bearing the brunt of this burden. So, how does she conclude? Is everybody fucked? Not entirely. So yes, if you get to her last page, a small paragraph based on confronting apartheid, in which she says that yes, people are very oppressed, but that should not mean that they are overwhelmed. She says that interlocking oppressions are often discussed in the additive terms of double or triple burdens, and it makes you seem like that women are overwhelmed. But in fact, she says they are not completely overwhelmed. That ethnographic analysis of ordinary women corroborates the practice theory notion that within structures of domination, no matter how severe, there exist constraints on as well as spaces and opportunities for resistance and contestation. So things can be pretty bad, but however bad things get, there's going to be spaces for resistance and contestation. Interesting, Haley here, she is citing a Iwa Ong's work, but it's an earlier work than what she wrote on as flexible citizenship. It is more based in an ethnographic example. So Iwa Ong's first book was called Spirits of Resistance and Capitalist Discipline, Factory Women in Malaysia, in which she was examining how women in some of these sweatshops were becoming possessed by spirits, which is a traditional thing that would happen to them, but then that was used as a way of resisting some of the capitalist impositions on them. So this was for those of us who in the last class were saying that Ong didn't have many ethnographic examples, I think this was a good ethnographic example. It was earlier than her work on flexible citizenship, which seemed to be less ethnographic. And that is the reason why I did not have us read this article, the very last article called Non-Hegemonic Globalization's Alternative Transnational Processes and Agents, was in part because the title was hurting our eyes. But Gustavo Lins Ribeiro is a pretty nice guy. And what he was talking about, so hegemonic globalization is perhaps what Faye Harrison was detailing, this idea of being the structural adjustment and neoliberal economic policies from above. In this article, he wanted to discuss globalization from below, or grassroots globalization. So that's what he means by non-hegemonic globalization. Now, in the abstract for this article, which I looked up, the full article and perhaps the book that he edits, he says that it is going to be about this globalization from below is based on the activities of trader tourists, street vendors, and markets of global gadgets or pirated goods, mostly on Brazilian and Paraguayan examples. And so this would be super interesting to read about, right? You'd have these globalization from below, the people who are selling these so-called pirated goods in different markets and circulating around there. And so we would have what he calls a non-hegemonic world system, something that is going on from below. If that was the stuff that was included in this selection, I definitely would have had you read it. Unfortunately, most of what he talks about here, what they've included here, were about the street demonstrations, the anti-globalization street demonstrations, which were important at the time. I don't know if they're really still going on today. So these were the people who were protesting actions taken by the IMF, or the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. And this was a really big deal back in the 1990s and 2000s. So what I'm saying is, I wish in this section we had more ethnographic examples of globalization, both from above and below, and the resistance part. I would have been more excited about that. Faye Harrison gives us a good example of summing up the hegemonic globalization, mentioning some of the resistance from below, and we can at least know that there's some non-hegemonic globalization going on.